Hello students, and welcome to this lecture on Exodus and the other books of the law. And hopefully we'll hopefully we'll also have an opportunity to talk a little bit about the books of Joshua and Judges as well. So as you have been studying a little bit, reading the assigned readings, I just want to review a little of this and kind of catch us up before we start talking about Exodus. What kind of sets up the narrative of Exodus. So, at the end of Genesis, we have Abraham, who has become the father of Isaac. Isaac, the child of promise, becomes the father of two sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob is chosen as the child of promise. Jacob will have 12 sons. And also in the book of Genesis, Jacob has his name changed to Israel, and consequently, when we talk about the children of Israel, we're talking about the children of Jacob, the grandson of Abraham. And that phrase, children of Israel, very often denotes all those who are descended from Israel, not necessarily his literal children. In fact, most of the time you see that. It's always, almost always referring to descendants, generations away from the original Jacob, Israel. As I said, he has 12 children. These in turn become the 12 patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. Some of these tribes I'm sure you're familiar with. Levi, Judah, those are the two main tribes, but there are 10 others as well. Judah will become very important later because the tribe of Judah will be the tribe which God will bring the Messiah through. So Jesus is descended from the tribe of Judah. The tribe of Levi is important because Levi gives to Israel the line of the priests and the Levites who serve in the temple. So the ministers of temple worship in ancient Israel all come from Levi. So that's why these two tribes in particular are very important to the Jewish people to this day. The other tribes, it's not that that they don't matter at all. They're not chopped liver. It just means that God uses Levi and Judah. He chooses them for a special work for his purposes. But leading into Exodus, the main figure at the end of the book of Genesis is one of the sons of Jacob, who is not Judah, not Levi, but a man named Joseph. And if you know the story of Joseph, he's one of Jacob's youngest sons from his beloved wife Rachel. When Rachel dies in childbirth with Joseph's younger brother Benjamin, these are the only sons of Rachel. The other sons come from his three other wives. So Joseph and Benjamin are doted upon by Jacob, and when parents have favorites, it usually leads to discord in the family, and this is exactly what happens. Joseph's brothers become insanely jealous of him. One day, Jacob sends Joseph to spy on his brothers, and they take him, they throw him in a cistern, and debate what to do with him. Some of them want to kill him, but they see some Ishmaelite traders, these nomads, that go back and forth between Egypt and Canaan, and they see these Ishmaelites and they decide to sell their brother as a slave to the Ishmaelites. And so the Ishmaelites take Joseph to Egypt, and by a strange divine turn of events, God will eventually bring Joseph into the government of Egypt. He will become basically the prime minister of Egypt, and eventually what happens is there's a famine in Canaan, and Jacob sends his sons to Egypt where there is food through the wisdom of Joseph. Joseph has managed to preserve stockpiles of food during 7 years, because the Lord reveals to him through Pharaoh's dream that there will be 7 good years and 7 years of famine. And so they take precautionary measures to stockpile loads and loads of food. And so then when all of the ancient Near Eastern world is struck with famine, the only place where there's food left is in Egypt. So Jacob sends his sons, the remaining sons, down to Israel. They are reacquainted with Joseph. I'm giving you the very short version. It's a delightful story. You really should read the story of Joseph in Genesis. It's one of the most beautiful works of ancient literature that you can find. But to make a very long and beautiful story short and awkward, what happens is Joseph winds up saving his family by providing them with food, a place to stay, and all of Jacob's family, all of Israel's family, moves down to Egypt, to the land of Goshen, which is part of Egypt, to live with Joseph there in Egypt. By the way, Joseph is a type of Jesus. We're going to talk a lot about types. And a type is from a Greek word, typos, which means a model. So a lot of the figures that we encounter in the Old Testament, sometimes actually Bible characters, sometimes things, sometimes events, a lot of these figures prefigure, they are a model of something that will be realized in the New Testament. There's a very famous statement, I believe that Daphnis and Levering refer to it in their book, but St. Augustine says that the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed, and the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. And so a lot of times we have these figures in the Old Testament that kind of point us to what God is going to do in the New. Joseph is one of these figures. He is a child of Israel who is betrayed by his own people, his brothers, sold into slavery for some silver coins, and in spite of what Israel, the children of Israel, intend for his evil, he winds up saving the world by preserving all of the stockpile of food. And in that way, he saves his own brothers, his own family, but also the rest of the world. And this is exactly what happens with Jesus. Jesus comes to his own. This is what St. John says in his Gospel. Jesus comes to his own, and his own received him not. He comes to his own people, to Israel. They reject him. They hand him over to the Gentiles. Judas, named after Judah, the patriarch, Judas actually sells our Lord for 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests, who in turn hand him over to the Romans. So Jesus is rejected by his own people, the Hebrews, the children of Israel, and what they intend for evil, God uses for the salvation not only of Israel, but for the entire world, as we are told in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. At the end of the story of Joseph, after Israel has died, the sons of Israel come to Joseph. They're very concerned that maybe it's going to be payback time, understandably so. So they come to Joseph, asking for forgiveness, and basically saying, "We will be your slaves, just don't kill us." And this is what Joseph responds to them, starting at verse 18. So Genesis 50:18. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Fear not, for am I in the place of God? As for you," this is what's really important, "as for you, you meant evil against me. But God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." So in the same way that what Joseph's brothers, the children of Israel, intended for evil. They did not intend to save the world by selling their brother into slavery. They actually intend to get rid of this good-for-nothing brother of theirs. In the same way, the children of Israel will hand over Jesus for evil. They want to get rid of the guy. So they hand him over for evil to the Romans, but what they intend for evil, God will use for good. The reason I am taking the time, besides the beauty of that little story, but the reason that we're taking a little bit of time to set this up is because we've had Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 brothers all living in Canaan, which will become the land of Israel. This is the promised land. But as we get to the book of Exodus, here we are 400 some years later, and they're no longer in Canaan, they are in Egypt. How did they get to be in Egypt? Well, it's because of them all moving down to Egypt to be with Joseph, where there's good food so that they can survive. But at the end of the lives of the patriarchs, they don't move back to Canaan. You can imagine how this comes to be. I mean, a lot of times when you consider, for instance, refugees, when refugees come to the United States, they, generally speaking, do not move back home to their homelands. This isn't because they don't want to go back home. It's very difficult to move back home, especially after they've started a new life here. And so this is how we've become a nation of immigrants. In fact, my own family, going back to the 1700s, as a matter of fact, were refugees. Starting out, in the 1600s, the Umbergers were refugees from the 30 Years' War in Switzerland. And so they began a long, over many generation process of wanderings, which eventually landed them in the 1700s in Pennsylvania. They didn't come here because they were adventurous types. They didn't come here because of business opportunities. They came here to get away from trouble. And here we are, 300 years later, and I have no intention to move back to Switzerland. Switzerland wouldn't let me, I don't think, just because my forefathers came from there. So Israel's in kind of a similar state. They came to Egypt to get out of a bad situation, famine. They start a new life there in Egypt, and at the end of the famine, they don't just pack up and move back home because they have a new home in Egypt. They're comfortable there. Fast forward 400 years, and we have a new situation. In some of our discussions, we've talked about what can and cannot be substantiated with science and archaeology, and I've cautioned against trying to find proofs in archaeology for the Bible. I think archaeology is wonderful to illustrate the world of the Bible, but very seldom do we actually find documented evidence of things in the Bible. But one of the interesting things from the time of this period, and that might illustrate what's going on, might give some evidence to the book of Exodus, is the coming of the Hyksos into Egypt. So there is around, I think it's in the 1500s BC, there was an incursion into Egypt of Western Semitic peoples that the Egyptians will call the Hyksos. We're talking about peoples that are related to the Aramaeans, the Canaanites, and even, I would say, people very similar to the Hebrews, culturally similar to the Hebrews, and with a language similar to Hebrew. The Hyksos actually overthrow the government of the Egyptians, and they make themselves pharaohs for a number of generations. When the Egyptians rise up against the Hyksos and drive them out of their country, anything that has a kind of air of Northwest Semitic peoples Aramaic, Aramaeans, Canaanites, the language of Hebrew. Anything like that is going to be going to be looked at with suspicion. Okay. So as we get into the book of Exodus, so again, remember Joseph has done all of these wonderful things for the people of the Egyptians. How is it that the Hebrews living in Egypt come to be hated and enslaved? Well, if you look at the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 8, it says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." And quite possibly, this reflects the historical event of this kind of break in the dynasty of the pharaohs, in which the Hyksos are driven out, and now you have kind of a reboot of native-born Egyptian pharaohs. And so there's a historical break in Egyptian history, is the point. Not only this, when the native-born Egyptians regain control of their country, remember they're very suspicious of people like the Hyksos that have ruled over them. And so this is what it says, verse 9. He said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply." And here's the real key. "And if war befall us, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." So what they're concerned with is that the Hebrews have more of a cultural affinity for these Hyksos, or people like the Hyksos, than they do to the Egyptians. They're living as aliens within Egypt, and they speak a language more closely related to Hyksos, they dress like Hyksos, and so the fear is, if the Hyksos come back, who are the Hebrews going to side with? Are they going to be allied with us against the Hyksos, or are they going to team up against us? Kind of a natural fear. I think it's to draw an analogy that might make some of you uncomfortable, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. When some of our cultural attitudes in the United States right now towards Muslims and Middle Easterners, I think, are analogous to what's going on with the Egyptians. We wonder whether Muslims can actually be good Americans, whether they can be, if their allegiance to the United States would stand if there was a major terrorist attack, for instance, on our country. It's a similar attitude that the Egyptians have towards the Hebrews. And so, you know the story, I hope, that Pharaoh then decides to take measures to suppress the Hebrews. And he enslaves them and presses them into service. When that doesn't work, he begins to kill the male children, and so on and so forth. And one of the male children that is born is Moses, who is saved miraculously by actually being adopted into the house of Pharaoh by Pharaoh's daughter. Let's talk a little bit about the major themes of Exodus. We don't have time to talk about every major story in the book. You really should read Exodus. You probably don't want to read the entire book, but if you're going to try to read Exodus, I think the first 20 chapters would really hold your attention well. After chapter 20, you start to get into a lot of the more arcane laws, and while I find them fascinating, I would not be surprised that you would find that part quite boring, and you might want to skip over to about halfway into the book of Numbers or something. Skip over Leviticus. So if you read the first 20 chapters of Exodus, and then pick it back up around the middle of Numbers, and you'll get into the narrative again, the story part of the Pentateuch. But the three major themes of Exodus that we find are redemption, how God saves his people from slavery. The second major theme is the law, the Torah. Torah is Hebrew for law. Literally, it means teaching. Technically, the 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, are called Torah by the Jewish people. And so it's a little confusing because Torah technically is law, but it also includes a lot of the stories we've been talking about. They're part of the law, the Torah. And that's also quite interesting to me that you have the law of Israel is not just a list of all of these legal codes, but all of it is framed in a narrative. And I think that's important. The way that God speaks to Israel, reveals himself and his will for Israel, is not by just giving them a bunch of boring laws, but he couches it in an aesthetic narrative that will actually speak to the heart. The final part of Exodus, the last really 10 chapters, really the last 10 chapters are mostly focused on worship. So that's the third theme, preparing a place of worship for God to dwell actually in Israel's midst. So we get a lot of instructions. Again, this is rather boring if you're not actually interested in this sort of thing. But we get real detailed instructions for a portable temple. We call it the tabernacle, which actually comes from the Latin word taberna, which means tent, because it's a tent in which the cultic worship of God takes place. We're talking about sacrifices, primarily. So we have this portable shrine. Taberna, by the way, is also where we get our word tavern. So I kind of like this idea of going to meet God in this public place of worship or of drink. But anyway, we have this tabernacle. In Hebrew, it's called the Mishkan, and a Mishkan that word Mishkan comes from the word for dwelling, or neighbor, or neighborhood. God wants to be Israel's neighbor. And so later in the book of Numbers, it describes, again in a kind of a boring part of the Pentateuch, but important, it describes the camp of Israel as they're wandering through the wilderness. And the tabernacle is placed in the exact middle of the camp, and all of the tribes are camped in an organized manner all around the tabernacle. So God is out camping in the desert with his people Israel. It's a beautiful picture. So God wants to have such a fellowship with Israel that he's actually living in their midst as their neighbor in the Mishkan, the dwelling place. Again, talking about typology, later St. John in his gospel, he will tell us in John chapter 1, verse 14, he says, the Word became flesh. The Word of God became flesh, and he dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. We have beheld his glory. Glory is of the only Son from the Father. And that word there, dwelt, in Greek it literally is he tabernacled. He pitched his tent among us. So in the incarnation, when the eternal Word of the Father comes and lives among us in Jesus, we have kind of a deepening of this Mishkan concept. No longer is God just have a symbol of his presence among his people, but he actually becomes one of us and lives among us in Jesus. Let's talk a little bit about the law. One of the problems with law for us is when we think of law, we don't think of the law, we think of laws. And for us, laws have a restrictive connotation. None of us really get excited about laws because they seem to, think about the speed limit. If you're like me, you would like to drive faster than the speed limit. But we have these dang laws that cramp our style, right? Well, taking that kind of relationship that we have to our civil laws and approaching the Torah kind of sets us up for misunderstanding it. We think of law as a hindrance, as something that restricts our freedom. The concept of law in the Old Testament is that the Torah actually gives freedom. It releases someone, liberates someone, so that they can do what is right, that they can do what they are meant to do, to be who they are meant to be. In fact, the rabbis, they say that Israel is not really free from Egypt until God gives them the Torah on Mount Sinai. So, the Torah actually liberates us. It enables us to be what God meant us to be. It lays out a path of love and holiness. Love is liberating. I was just reading today a really nice book by Christopher Kaiser called, I'm trying to remember what is The Gospel of Happiness. I think that's it. Yes, The Gospel of Happiness by Christopher Kaiser. And he says in this book, he talks about this study that was done, I think it was at Harvard or Yale, but I think it was at Harvard, done over 75 years, and they invested all of this money, and at the end of this time, they discovered that the real key to happiness, by studying all of these graduates from their university, keeping records on them, some of these people, like their whole lifespan, from the time that they're in their 20s all the way up through their 90s, they find that the one single factor, like all of them would say, this made me happy, or this made me unhappy. So happiness is kind of a personal thing. But there was one common thread that they found after spending millions and millions of dollars on this study, was that love was really the key to happiness. Well, they're discovering something that God told us a long time ago. God made us to be happy. God made us for love. That's actually saying the same thing. We're made to be in relationship with one another and with God. And so God gives Torah to Israel to give them a concrete expression of love, both towards one another and towards Him. So we're made to love, we're made to be free to love, so God gives Israel a law that liberates them to love. When we love God, this is also an expression of holiness. Let's talk a little bit about holiness. When we think about holy today, I think a lot of us have, again, some negative connotations. We think about people that are holier than thou, right? People who think they're all uppity and spiritual. Maybe we think of holiness in terms of what holiness is not. So we might think that if someone is holy, they don't cuss, they don't drink, they don't chew, they don't go out with girls that do. That someone who's holy is pure. We might think in terms of sexual purity, something like this. Those things can be related to holiness, but not necessarily. At its root, holiness means being different. It means being set apart. It means being special for a certain purpose or for a certain person. So, for instance, if we were not in a virtual classroom, but a literal classroom where I could actually see your beautiful faces, I might bring in a giant Hershey's bar and start splitting it off, breaking it up for everyone. Before I break up those little pieces of the Hershey's bar, that Hershey's bar is common. It belongs to everyone, right? But as soon as you receive your little square of that chocolate, if someone else in the classroom comes by and takes it or breaks it in half or something, you're going to say, hey, that's mine. And rightfully so. You couldn't say that before I broke it into pieces. That would be the whole class's Hershey's bar. But now you can say, no, that is mine. Another way of saying that is holy to me. Again, in marriage, when my wife and I made vows to one another on our wedding day, we basically said, I am holy to you, you are holy to me. I have relationships with all sorts of people, but none of my relationships are like the relationship that I have with my wife. That relationship is special. And so she belongs to me, I belong to her in a way that no one else can lay claim to, right? We're holy one to the other. Well, God wants his people to be holy. Not meaning that they're like spiritually uppity, not meaning that they don't chew tobacco like all the other nations do. There isn't tobacco in the Old Testament, actually. Not that they behave necessarily in a different way, but that they belong to him. That's what holiness means. And so he gives Israel laws that will kind of set a boundary around them from the other nations and make them holy. This is a liberating thing. When I got married to my wife, I didn't say, oh dang, now this is the only woman that I can romance. I didn't feel that way at all. I was thrilled, I was overjoyed, because now I had a means of expressing my love for her that I did not have before our marriage. It was liberating. And only people who are married or have almost gotten, preparing for marriage, can really understand what I'm talking about there, I think. But it was a liberating event. Being married is liberating. I'm free to love my wife in a way that I wasn't before. So yes, there are some restrictions about being married. I can't have a relationship with other women like I have with my wife, but that's really a liberating thing, because it means that relationship with my wife is deepened even more than it could possibly be with anyone else. It liberates. So freedom in the law is not limited. It's actually protected. It's guarded. And that's a very important function of Torah that often gets lost. Remember, God, his goal for Israel is that he will live in their midst. He wants to dwell together in communion with Israel. And so there are some house rules. Remember when you were living with your parents? There were certain things that you had to do while you lived there. Maybe your parents said, as my parents said, when you get your own place, you can do this. You can live however you want. But while you're living under my roof, you're going to, pick up your clothes off the floor or whatever. It's kind of the same thing. God's saying, I want to live in relationship with you. In order for this to work, there are certain ground rules that we have to live under. You keep up your end of the bargain, and I'll keep up mine. Now, just like you probably did when you lived under your parents' house, under their roof, Israel begins to grumble. So there's a lot of grumbling in the Torah, a lot of grumbling in the Pentateuch, a lot of grumbling in Exodus. It starts in Exodus and it continues all the way through Numbers. Israel grumbles, and they grumble and they grumble. Why do they grumble? And they'll even say things like, wow, remember how good it was when we lived in Egypt. Remember all the good food we got to eat, the fish that came out of the Nile, the leeks and onions that grew, the melons, the cucumbers. Remember all that good stuff. And here all we have is this rotten manna that falls down from heaven every day. They grumble and they grumble and grumble. Why are they grumbling? Well, slavery is comfortable. Think about that. In a certain way, slavery is comfortable because you don't have to make decisions. You don't have any responsibility for yourself. Someone else is calling all of the shots for you. So you have room and board provided for you. Slavery to sin is also comfortable. So we have these laws that are leading us out of bondage to sin, so that we're free to love. And we remember sometimes the old life. Sometimes the law chafes against our sinful nature. We want to go back to the old ways. And so we grumble. But there are some things that are more important, that are better than comfort. Sometimes it's true, living under God's law is not always comfortable, but in the end, we have to believe it is more fulfilling. So, returning to Torah, we have, if the rabbis reading the Torah, they count 613 commandments. All sorts of different commandments, very particular commandments. Commandments relating to even like what kind of clothing you wear, what food you eat, when you can work and when you cannot, so on and so forth. When you can build a fire. You're not allowed to build a fire on the Sabbath day, for instance. 613 commandments, very particular. All of these are rather external, right? They don't, for the most part. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, we're not talking about matters of the heart. We're talking about an external action. When we get to the gospel, a lot of times Christians feel as though the Torah doesn't really matter to us because that was given to the Hebrews, and now under the gospel, now that Jesus is here, we no longer have Torah. There's actually a lot we can learn from Torah as Christians. I'm convinced that Jesus did not come to abrogate Torah. This is what he says, actually, in the book of Matthew, chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount. So turning to Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says to the people gathered on that mountain, verse 17, Matthew 5:17, "Think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And Jesus doesn't lie. So Jesus says he didn't come to abolish the Torah. The Torah still stands somehow. So how do we understand this? Well, first of all, Jesus later in the Gospels gives us two commandments, and he says that these kind of sum up the law and the prophets. Do you remember these commandments? Sometimes we call these the two great commandments, or greatest commandments. The greatest commandment is this. It's from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." The Gospels will add the word mind. Love the Lord with all your heart, your soul, your strength, and your mind. Love God with all of your person, in other words. That's the first and greatest commandment. Love God. Second commandment, from the book of Leviticus, Jesus says, is to love your neighbor as yourself. So he takes two of these 613 commandments, and he says, really, what all of these commandments are about are these two things: loving God and loving neighbor. Okay? And so, as Christians, we focus more on these general commandments of loving God and loving neighbor. These laws are not as particular for us, but we have to be careful. Sometimes I hear Christians talk as though the law for Christians is easier than it was for the Hebrews. They had this burdensome Torah, and now for us, Jesus came to release us from the law. Again, read the Sermon on the Mount and pay attention to it. Jesus actually is more strict than Torah. Often he says, you have heard it said, for instance, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. He's quoting Torah there. And then he says, but I say to you, if someone strikes you on one side of your face, turn to them the other, right? Turn the other cheek. And you are not allowed to take revenge, even though Moses allowed it. He's not saying Moses is wrong, he's just saying that God's will goes even further than the law of Moses. So Jesus is actually strict, more strict than the law of Moses. Again, the law against adultery in Exodus 20, one of the Ten Commandments, right? You shall not commit adultery. Jesus warns us that if you just think that by not committing the physical act, you have avoided abrogating that law, that you have not broken the law against adultery because you have not committed a physical act of sexual immorality, he says you're wrong. If you even lust for another person in your heart, you are guilty of that, of breaking that commandment. Again, Ten Commandments says, do not murder. And so that's one that often we say, right? Well, I'm a pretty decent fellow. I've never murdered anyone. Well, Jesus says, wait a minute. If you even hate someone, if you harbor hatred in your heart towards another fellow human being, then you're guilty of murder. You are subject to judgment. And I don't know about you. I'm guessing it's true of you as it is of me. There have been moments in my life where I have had hatred towards other people. I'm guilty of murder, according to Jesus. So Jesus goes one step further. He's saying the Pentateuch, the laws in the Pentateuch, it's not that it was burdensome and went too far, and so we're going to make things easier for you all. It's actually that the law of Moses doesn't go far enough. And so by making the law, the Torah, less particular, he actually makes it go deeper. It actually becomes, it takes more commitment to fulfill the Torah. And the only person who could possibly fulfill Torah was Jesus. And I would say also his mother, because I'm Catholic. But Jesus is the only one who fulfills it. By the way, the only reason Mary fulfills Torah is because of Jesus. She's given grace preemptively through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross that preserves her from sin. So even she fulfills Torah through the grace of her son, Jesus. So Jesus is the only person who could fulfill the law. We rely on his grace. We do our best, and we ask for forgiveness when we break God's law, because we all do. Doesn't mean that we just kick it to the curb and say, that's not for us Christians anymore. The truth is, we're living under an even higher standard. Jesus calls us to be even more holy than the law of Moses called the people of Israel. The greatest threat to Torah living is idolatry. And so right there in the Ten Commandments, the first commandment is against having any other gods. We human beings are always tempted to put our faith in something besides our Creator. And so over and over again, we see God punishing, disciplining Israel, trying to purify them of all of these other allegiances that call them away from their worship of the one true God. Idolatry, I think, again, it's easy for us to think, oh, I don't have any problems with that. I don't have any idols in my house. Well, idolatry, for instance, St. Paul will say in one of his epistles that love of money is idolatry. Greed is idolatry. Idolatry can have a lot of different forms. Anytime that you put the love of something that is created over the love of the Creator, you are guilty of idolatry. So we don't have to have literal idols to be guilty of idolatry. Let's talk a little bit, now that we've talked about idolatry. So we have false gods. And even our conception of the one true God can be idolatrous in a way. It can be inaccurate. So at the beginning, before the law is given, before Israel is liberated, God reveals himself to Moses in a special way on Mount Sinai, where the law will be given when after Israel is redeemed from Egypt. So at Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 4, God reveals his new name to Moses in the burning bush. Thinking a little bit about just the very symbol of the burning bush is interesting, isn't it? The bush is not consumed, and yet there is fire burning in it. And usually fire consumes that which it burns. Fire cannot coexist with the material which it is burning. But this bush is not burned up. It remains. And so a lot of commentators have seen in this an image of who God is. God is the only thing that can coexist within his creation without kind of pushing out the existence of that creation. God doesn't have to displace the created order in order to exist within it, in other words. So he's not like fire, which burns up the more that it burns up the host that it is burning in. God can burn within us, if you will, without consuming us. Okay? He can exist within all things without consuming them. God reveals his name to Moses in a way that he has not revealed it to the patriarchs. His name is I am that I am. In Hebrew, it's very hard to translate. Eyeh asher eyeh. A little bit more closely, it would be I will be who I will be. But that doesn't quite catch it either. In any case, it has this idea of being. God's name is not one of the other names that we have for all of these gods, all the Egyptian gods, Osiris or Horus, not one of the Canaanite gods like Baal-Hadad, not one of the Assyrian gods like Ashur, or one of the Babylonian gods like Marduk. He doesn't have a name like that. His name is simply put, being. God is saying to Moses that I am not a being like you run into every day or like you conceive of the Egyptian gods. I'm not a particular being. I am being itself. He is the ground of all being. Again, he can fill up creation without consuming it. He has to fill up creation because otherwise creation will not exist. Because he is the being that gives creation its existence. I think this is a very important point, especially when we think about some of the attacks on religion today. A lot of times our opponents conceive of God, or our concept of God, as though he's like this kind of, I often hear this sort of thing, right? I don't believe in some bearded fairy tale man living in the sky. Well, I don't believe in that either, right? I believe in being. That's who God is. God is actually all of the ground of all existence. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not saying that everything is God. There is a distinction between created and creator. But the creator actually is the being that gives all things their existence. So, in a way, if you look at everything that exists, including yourself, underneath your existence is existence itself. That is God. God is right there. This is why we can encounter God everywhere and in everything. In some ways, we don't have to make a pilgrimage to some shrine somewhere. We don't have to, even though we encounter God in a special way in church, you don't have to go to church to encounter God. You don't have to encounter God in the Bible. You can encounter God anywhere you are because God is existence itself. So everything in our created order is filled with God. A better way to put it is actually, it's not that God is in everything, it's actually more like everything is in God. He is the ocean that we're swimming in. Later in the book of Acts, St. Paul in Acts chapter 17, he's quoting actually a Stoic philosopher, a Greek philosopher named Aratus, and he says, in him, in God, we live and move and have our being, right? So God is not out there somewhere. God is not a particular being, but God is actually the existence in which we live and move and have our own being. Our being is derived from his beingness. Okay? So God has a strange name, I am that I am. It's related to the divine name, the Tetragrammaton, which means the four-lettered name. We usually do not pronounce that name. I'm going to go ahead and say it here, but I would just say that before the time of Christ, the Jewish people, for the reverence of God's name, again, to fulfill the third commandment, which says, the second commandment, which says, "You shall not take the name of the Lord in vain." They have not pronounced the divine name for such a long time that we've forgotten how to pronounce it, actually. But usually we say Yahweh. In Hebrew, these are four consonants: Y, H, W, H. We don't know what vowels went with these consonants because we haven't pronounced that name for such a long time. The Jewish people were only allowed to pronounce the name once a year by one person. The high priest, on the Day of Atonement, would enter the Holy of Holies in the temple, and in his special prayer, he would utter the divine name. Today, we do not say it. Sometimes you hear in, there's some Christian choruses that use the name Yahweh. I'm not comfortable with that myself. You may have heard the word Jehovah. Jehovah is actually from Martin Luther's mistaken attempt to pronounce these consonants without the vowels. So he supplied the vowels from the word Elohim and Adonai, and he tried to put these consonants together with those vowels, and he came up with Yehovah in German, and in English we changed it to Jehovah. So that's what you find in the King James Bible, for instance. But that's probably not the way his name was pronounced. We just don't know how it was pronounced. In any case, that name, the YHWH, sounds very similar to the Hebrew word I will be, Ehyeh. So Yahweh and Ehyeh, I think you can hear there are some similarities there between these two words. And so we think that most Bible scholars do not think that Yahweh means being. It probably was the name of a tribal deity that the Hebrews had before the revelation at Mount Sinai. But God takes this name and he gives it new meaning now when he gives this new name to himself to Moses. I am that I am. And so from that time on, the name Yahweh, the divine name, will have this connotation of being with it. Because God is being and not a being, that means he courts no rivals. You cannot compare God to any other thing. You cannot replace God. It's not like the Greek pantheon, right, where you have this lineage of, first you have Kronos. First you have Uranos, the heaven, and then you have Kronos, time, and then you have Zeus. And each of these characters usurps the one before him from his divine throne and becomes the head honcho. Well, that's never going to happen with God, because God is not a particular being that could be cast from his throne. You understand? If God were usurped of his divinity, all creation would just cease to exist. Because he's not a character in our existence, he is existence itself. And so the very idea that you would have an idol is preposterous. That you would try to put something else on the same level as God is just absurd. And yet we do it all the time, and you're going to see that Israel, as you read the Bible, and they do it time and time again. We have this endless cycle of rebellion against God, where Israel turns to idolatry. They turn away from the one true God. And so this is something that's important to remember. God's not threatened. When we hear God say, "I am a jealous God," it's not that he's threatened by these rival gods. It's that he cares so much for Israel, he doesn't want them to give their hearts to something that is just a figment, a shadow of who he is as the ground of all existence. Before we stop here, let's talk a little bit about the plagues. So Moses comes to Egypt. Remember, so we've got this new revelation of God, of divinity as being existence itself. And now he's coming into Egypt, and Egypt is full of idolatry. Pharaoh himself is a god. And so Moses comes to Pharaoh and he says, "I have a message from the Lord. The Lord says, 'Let my people go.'" And what is Pharaoh's response? "I do not know this Lord you speak of." Which God is this that you're talking about? Never heard of him. And Pharaoh cannot grasp the magnitude of the God that Moses serves. He thinks he is one of these gods, like the gods of Egypt. And so, since he's never heard of him, he doesn't recognize his power, his authority. And so he's not impressed. And so what ensues, then, is a very calculated attack on the Egyptian religion. One after another, the gods of Egypt are thrown down in the plagues. Every one of the plagues, the 10 plagues that strike Egypt, is actually aimed at a particular god that the Egyptians worship. Let's just consider the first plague and the last plague, since we don't have much time left. The first plague, the Nile River turns to blood. Well, the Nile was actually worshipped by the Egyptians as a god. The life in Egypt depended on the Nile because if you know any of your geography, maybe you've heard about the annual flooding of the Nile. Every year, the flood waters of the Nile come up, and when they go down, they leave a very rich soil and a soil that is watered from the Nile. It does not rain, really, in Egypt. Very rarely does it rain. So all of the water that they are going to irrigate their crops with comes from that Nile. So they actually worship the Nile. Well, the first plague, Aaron, the brother of Moses, who will become the first high priest of Israel, Aaron goes down to the banks of the Nile, and what does he do? He takes his rod and he strikes the Nile. And what happens? The Nile bleeds. It looks like he deals a death blow to the Nile. And everything in the Nile dies, all the fish die, even the waters from the cisterns and the wells near the Nile, all of these turn to blood, and the people cannot drink it. This is a direct attack on worship of the Nile. God is saying, "I am greater than the Nile God." All of the plagues, in turn, have something like this going on with them. When we get to the last of the plagues, the death of the firstborn children, remember, Pharaoh himself is worshipped as the son of Ra, the sun god. He is actually considered to be divine. Well, the firstborn son of Pharaoh is going to be the next in the succession of the kings. He's going to be the next Pharaoh of Egypt. And God lays him down dead. God strikes him dead, thus proving his power even over the divinity of the Pharaoh. And so this is kind of a contest of the gods. And to us, again, since we aren't so acquainted with the worship of other gods, although there is a resurgence of neo-paganism in the world today, but since this isn't so familiar to us, maybe we don't catch the resonances of the plagues. But this is a very tactical attack upon the religion of Egypt, where God is trying to demonstrate that he is transcendent of all gods. He is not of the same divine order as the gods of Egypt. He is existence itself. And so he demonstrates his power in that manner, which makes it all the more absurd at the end of the story when Israel is redeemed from Egypt and they come to Mount Sinai. They're given the law, and the first thing they do is they break the very first commandment, right? By crafting a golden calf and worshiping something that is created by their own hands instead of the God of all creation. And that's the tragedy of idolatry. Again, before you are so hard on Israel, remember that you yourself, I myself, am very prone to idolatry. Very often, my heart is captivated by created things rather than by the Creator. Really quickly, there's so much here, there's just not time to cover it all. The rest of the Pentateuch, we have Leviticus. These are laws for the temple and temple worship for the priests. We have Numbers, which tells, it's called Numbers because of a census that's taken at the beginning of the book. In the book of Numbers, the children of Israel, again, they complain, they rebel, and as a consequence, they are prevented from entering the land for 40 years. So they wander in the wilderness. That journey should have taken 11 days. They wind up spending 40 years in the desert before they invade the Promised Land. At the end of the story, before Moses dies, we have Deuteronomy. Literally, this means second law, because it's a second giving of the law to Israel, a recitation, if you will, of the law. And then Moses passes away. The Lord buries him on Mount Nebo. We do not know where his tomb is to this day. And his successor, Joshua, will take them into the Promised Land. So that's what the book of Joshua is about, the conquest of the Promised Land. At the end of Joshua, Israel is in the land, but there's still there's a lot of work to do. There are many Canaanites still there possessing the land. And so Joshua, as he dies, he gives Israel the charge to complete the work that he started, to possess the land, and to be true to the law of Moses. In the next book, we get the book of Judges, which tells us about these kind of charismatic heroes. A judge is not somebody dressed in a black gown who's hearing legal cases all day. A judge is someone who is empowered by God to rescue Israel from their oppressors. We have a succession of judges, not kings. They are local leaders. They never rule over the entire nation, and they have only temporary periods of rule. It doesn't seem as though they have a lifelong rule, and it's not a dynasty. After they die, their children do not take up after them. At the end of the book of Judges, things are a mess. If you read the book of Judges, we have a little appendix from chapter 17 through the end, and there are 3 times that we have a certain phrase repeated. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. This is not a good thing. We have anarchy. And to stress how bad it is, the most horrendous story in the Old Testament is told to finish out the book of Judges. And when you get done with the book of Judges, you're screaming, "Oh my goodness, just get a king already so that you stop living like heathens." And so that leads us to the next lecture about the kingship in Israel and about the Davidic dynasty. God bless you. I'll see you next week.